Now joining me in the studio with more insight into this is Jeff Aludo. He's a managing director of advisory firm Africa Practice East Africa. As always, welcome to the show, Jeff.
Thank you very much.
Now, looking at the UNCTAD's SDG goal, unlike the MDGs, we're seeing them looking to the private sector to sort of drive the success of these SDGs. Now, has the private sector taken an active lead in sort of driving these SDGs, and how much interest have you seen from the private sector since they launched these goals in 2015?
Well, you know, I think there is a big difference between the MDGs and the SDGs, as you know. I think the biggest difference is that the SDGs, or the authors of the SDGs, ensured that there was inclusive negotiations with the private sector, essentially saying that a private sector needed to play a pivotal role in order to ensure that the initiatives of the SDGs were actually carried out and implemented. So private sector, having been instrumental in the development, have taken an active role. You will see that including with conferences, what you've seen with UNCTAD 14, with the World Investment Forum running alongside it, ensuring that private sector is getting a voice and that their voice are heard whenever the decisions are being made around policy or around implementation.
Now, considering the challenges the MDGs face in terms of the convergence between the private sector and, of course, the government, how do you think they can work better together this time around? Do you think that they need to change their strategy this time around? Well,
I think definitely. There needs to be a change of strategy, but the good news is that we're already seeing that change in strategy. And that's come from better dialogue between the public and private sector. We've also seen that clearly in the SDG goals themselves, whereas I think the MDGs, the 8 MDG goals, were very clear about ending poverty and gender equality. You will find within the SDGs, you've got particular goals like Goal 17 that particularly talk to partnerships within private sector, that particularly talk to indicators that drive for private sector involvement. What we also saw with the UN launch in September 2015, when they launched the SDGs, was that private sector was involved, and they in fact made commitments as well. So whereas I think we saw heavy involvement with development assistance and funding from MDGs, with the launch of the SDGs, as you will recall, we saw quite a bit of private sector and philanthropies all commit to ensuring that there was funding for the SDGs. So we've already begun to see convergence between the private and the public sector. And I think if this dialogue continues and there is more participation where their voice is strengthened, then we will begin to see more involvement as well. Yeah.
Now, a recent UN report release said at least $600 billion will be needed each year to achieve the SDGs in Africa. Now, against the backdrop of the current global financial situation, with commodity prices coming down, with a slowdown in China, how do you think this is going to affect the funding? Do you think Africa is going to achieve that $600 billion figure?
Well, it is true that we've seen a little bit of a commodity downturn. There is a slump. And what we've therefore seen is heavily reliant African economies like Nigeria, Mozambique, Angola have seen quite a slump in their economies. So we've seen a little bit of a slowdown in the foreign direct inflows that are quite crucial to the implementation of the SDGs. The way it works is the economies, they raise their budgets, they ensure that they align those to the SDGs, and that's one way of driving and raising up that 600 billion. But I think what we've also seen, and we've seen it more recently with the UNCTAD and World Investment Forum that I participated in, is that the economies realize that they need to diversify. And so we've seen quite a few investments coming from the likes of China, although they've slowed down as well, but the likes of India, Malaysia and Singapore, that are FDI inflows that are actually geared towards the services space as opposed to just raw material space. So I think as long as African development leaders, African private sector follow through on diversification of these economies, we should see an acceleration. We took a big hit in FDI flows, probably nothing like pre-crisis, but we've also seen the past year, 36% increase in FDI flows from what was, and it's not as high as it was before the crisis, but we've begun to see an increase again as we've seen different strategies take root. So it's a daunting task, Uche. 600 billion annually is a daunting task. But I think if stakeholders come together, and that was the goal of the SDGs, if these stakeholders come together, government, private sector, philanthropies, and it's not just about profit, it's also about social impact, it is possible. And we're optimistic it's possible.
Well, thank you so much for giving us those insights, Jeff. Jeff Aludo joining us from advisory from Africa Practice East Africa.